Thank you everyone for joining this presentation. We are here to hear about IDEAL's Applied Research Award, Strategic Layering to Improve Household Gender Dynamics for Optimal Nutrition in Niger. I'm Beatrice Scheuermann, the IDEAL Small Grants Advisor, and I'm going to turn it over to Michelle Kendall from Catholic Relief Services to kick us off. Thank you, Michelle.
Yes, thank you very much, Beatrice. And I will not spend a lot of time. As I said, we just got an hour. We've got a presentation ready, and hopefully we'll have time for Q&A and discussion. So just very briefly, my name is Michelle Kendall. I'm a Senior Technical Advisor for Gender with CRS. Before we start, I'd maybe encourage, unfortunately, we don't have the time for individual introductions, but we do have a great group of people with us, both certainly from our BHA IDEAL colleagues, from CRS, and from our research partner, Penn State. So maybe if folks would take a moment to just introduce yourselves in the chat, that would be great. The institution you're coming from and maybe your role in the institution would be really helpful. I will just say, before we get started, that CRS and Penn State University are a research partner. We received this award. We're coming up on 2 years. The award focused, as the title says, on looking at strategic layering of, and our Penn State colleagues will certainly explain in much more detail, of 3 interventions, including a gender intervention within the Girma Rifsa in Niger. Basically, as I said, 2 years, and we'll certainly hear about some of the findings from that evaluation or research study. I do want to point out that with us on the CRS side, we do have a great team from the Girma and CRS Niger program team, including Girma's chief of party, our strategic learning lead, CRS Niger's head of programs. We may have our food security specialist, Lisa Kunin, may join us, and then of course the research team from CRS headquarters, and then our Penn State colleagues, the 2 principal investigators, Stephen Kodish and Muzi Na, as well as Francesca Giudici and Shake Ivania, who were also researchers on this study. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Steve, Muzi, Francesca, and Ivania.
Okay, thanks, Michelle. Can you hear me and see the slides okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, excellent. So thanks, Michelle, for that nice introduction. My name is Steve Kodish at Penn State, and Muzi and I served as PIs on this evaluation, but we're really just a mouthpiece for a larger team that involves all of those individuals that Michelle mentioned. So this is a real team effort, and even as late as last night, we're still interpreting some of these findings, and so we're trying to keep this presentation a little bit light so we can open it up for discussion and maybe some more lessons or perspectives from everyone here in the audience. Michelle provided a little bit of background, and from what I understood is that the audience here is pretty familiar with this program, given the various stakeholders. So just to quickly align us, though, we are evaluating this program in rural Niger, focused on these 3 different program modalities: the SILK, or the economic strengthening groups through the budgeting and savings and loans, the care groups, which are traditionally focused on women, and the emphasis here is on the nutrition education component. And then finally, this new-ish addition in the Niger setting is the couples strengthening piece, and we'll abbreviate that and refer to it as MFH throughout the presentation. We had 4 primary aims when we designed this evaluation. First, of course, is to determine the effectiveness of the layering of those 3 intervention modalities on the primary outcomes of maternal and child diet diversity, and those are children under 5. Aim 2 was to understand then what are these pathways that are affecting diet diversity? Where may things be breaking down if we're not seeing the outcomes of interest? Number 3, as part of a program evaluation, we always have a process piece. And so what are those contextual acceptability and dose and reach and fidelity issues that might have impacted outcomes during the study period? And then finally, what are some recommendations for improving this intervention in Niger, but also in other settings that might be similar globally? I will say AIM4, we were meant to travel to Niger in country to have a participatory workshop, but we did so virtually very recently due to in-country challenges that they're facing right now, of course. I just want to take a step back here and sure, let me just move my tab here. I apologize. So we've developed a kind of modified theory of change based on the CRS original theory of change, which was more detailed. But for me personally, telling maybe a more findings. And we'll refer to this theory of change a couple of different times throughout the presentation. But if you move left to right, here are our 3 program modalities, of course, and just immediate outcome or outputs, in addition to others that exist that I'll talk about today, are the improved relationship quality and marital satisfaction as a primary output of the MFH sessions, and certainly the better access to savings and loans that are directly linked to those silk economic strengthening groups. In our middle column, we have psychosocial outcomes, which are determinants of behavior. So really, this is a behavior change type of intervention with improving maternal and child diets at the far right, not nutritional status. But to change behavior, usually we look to knowledge, to self-efficacy or confidence to be able to carry out a behavior, people's attitudes toward that behavior, so their enthusiasm to carry it out, normative views, which is getting at social norms, so what I think other people might think about my engagement in this behavior, as well as self-efficacy to cook, to prepare, and to consume more nutritious diets. Intention, which is in our 3 boxes in the middle, is the closest determinant of most health and nutrition related behaviors. And that's why we placed it here as a primary determinant of that. What we hope would see through this program is joint decision-making between husbands and wives, increased women's inputs at the household level to have better diets for themselves and for their children. Just briefly for our evaluation methods, and we can dive into more detail through discussion for those interested. But really, we had a mixed methods, qualitative and quantitative program evaluation approach. We had the qualitative piece embedded within our 12-month time period that was the program evaluation. We started with a randomized controlled trial design, but due to some challenges in the field, it turned out to be a prospective non-randomized study design over a 12-month period. The baseline impact survey was conducted in February or March in 2022, and then 12 months later, to address seasonality concerns, the end-line survey was conducted. The qualitative piece, which tried to get at both AIMS 2 and AIMS 3 related to understanding outcomes as well as understanding process, was conducted at the end of 2022 and really ongoing the past several months when we're diving into program data, conducting secondary data analysis. Here's an implementation and study timeline that's pretty rough, but it gives you an idea of the challenges that both the implementers and the research team faced, starting from 2020, which we all remember quite well, leading into 2021 when Zinder region faced flooding and agricultural outcomes that were not ideal. And that fed into 2022 to 2023 when we had our evaluation period. And I'll dive into some more of these details throughout the findings, but it's good to keep in mind some of those contextual factors where implementation was occurring. The 3 modalities that we'll refer to throughout the findings are I1 in pink, which is the Silk Plus Care participants, I2, which is also in pink, which is the Silk Plus Care plus MFH. So that's that additional new piece of the couples strengthening, as well as then a control, which was unexposed villages in a different region. We had a number of different measures. Here are just some examples: household assets, access to loans and savings. We conducted dietary diversity scores using 24-hour dietary recalls. We assessed psychosocial determinants, including knowledge of maternal and child nutrition and microfinance, but also those others that I mentioned: attitudes, self-efficacy, normative views, and intention. We were interested to assess relationship quality as a result of MFH and the ability of women to have inputs into household decisions. And then finally, that last bullet, of course, we explored process or implementation related factors through both quantitative and qualitative measures. Overall, we had over 2,000 households at baseline and endline as part of our impact survey. We conducted 82 qualitative interviews, which is a generally pretty robust sample size for open-ended types of responses among both participants and MFH implementers. We conducted free lists and pile sorts, which you may not be too familiar with, but it's a way to understand cultural domain of community members. And we used this approach in this setting to try to build consensus around certain questions or to understand how groups of individuals in this cultural context think about foods and illnesses and how that might be a determinant of the behaviors of interest. We directly observed meals of household meals, as well as MFH sessions that were being conducted as part of our process evaluation. And then finally, to understand more normative views, we conducted focus group discussions, both among husbands and wives who were participants with MFH. Really, this is a nice triangulation of methods to corroborate and to see different perspectives for really drawing the most credible findings we could and interpretations. We tried to make this iterative to the best extent we could. We took whatever preliminary findings we had and incorporated them into our instrument designs during the qualitative data collection in particular, and we call that a form of member checking, being able to confirm certain preliminary findings with community members. And then finally, just earlier this week, we were able to validate at least many of our key findings with in-country stakeholders, thankfully through the virtual technology that we have. So overall, I would say that the research team finds the findings credible, and we built these approaches into the design specifically to do so. Our data analysis was both statistical and then also textual. On the left-hand side are just some key points, but we used a difference in difference estimates using multivariate regressions, both to understand the changes from baseline until endline between the three different intervention modalities. There were differences between our control group and our intervention 1 and 2 study arms, but we adjusted for those statistically as appropriate for generating findings. Our textual analysis included those 70 plus interviews, the focus group transcripts, and then field notes that were written in detail from our direct observations. We developed code books a priori based on our study aims and managed and analyzed data in deduced software. It was largely a content analysis or more of a deductive approach, but we did leave room for some emergent themes and sub-themes to arise that were not in our original code books. And for free lists and pile sorts, we conducted cultural domain analysis, and our observational data that was more numerical in nature, we used simple summary statistics. So let me dive into our findings right now. And we'll start with some of our primary outcomes on the right-hand side of that theory of change. Maternal diets was one of our primary outcomes. And maybe just to orient you, if you look at the top, I tried to keep the key finding at the top. If the details in the graph or in the writing are not so clear, but we did see an improvement in maternal dietary diversity scores from baseline to endline relative to control. If you look at the top of this figure, the solid line represents our control group. The dotted line represents our I2, and the third line, with the larger dashes represents our I1 intervention. So that was the silk plus the care group only. The dietary diversity scores increased 0.4, so that would represent approximately half of one food group, both in I1 relative to control and in I2 relative to control. But there was no difference, no treatment effect between I1 and I2 to see an added dietary improvement, at least thanks to MFH or attributable to MFH. We have a lot of numbers behind these, but I thought I would just bring out the key points first. We can dive into the some of those p-values if you're interested as through our discussion, but underlying those behavioral changes, we also saw overall very positive maternal psychosocial changes as well. So maternal intention to consume more diverse diets increased, maternal self-efficacy or confidence to do so also increased from baseline to endline. Normative views shifted positively, and these are all significant findings from baseline to endline relative to control, and maternal attitudes also improved. These are all quite positive and what we would expect to see in this pathway of behavior change. Paternal psychosocial constructs, which I don't have here, are more variable. They don't tell such a clear story. The primary impact is really through that maternal pathway. We did not see an improvement in maternal knowledge through our impact survey from baseline to endline, but this is an example of, and I'll orient you to it, an output from multi-dimensional scaling, which is part of cultural domain analysis. So we had 19 or 20 different food items that were generated through that free listing method, and we asked moms to sort them into different piles based on how nutritious they thought that they were. These clusters represent statistically significant consensus about the perceptions of nutritiousness for these various foods. And if you look at the most nutritious category, it includes foods like liver, banana, guava, orange, eggs, breast milk, moringa, which is a leafy green vegetable, and salad, which is a leafy green vegetable. I think all of us on this call would agree that those are all very nutritious. They're vitamins and mineral, they're vitamin and mineral rich, and that's what we would expect to see in a nutrition textbook as the most nutritious. The closer these two blue dots are to one another in this image represent how similar the participants perceive them to be to one another. And that's how the clustering is created. The least nutritious foods, some examples are porridge, millet, which is a staple, and maize-based products. Although they're perceived or thought to be least nutritious, those are the most commonly consumed foods. So really through this mixed methods approach, it seemed like knowledge was adequate overall, and probably not why we didn't see that gain. So something else is kind of in that knowledge behavior gap, and that's what we wanted to explore through other methods. If we move now to child diets, the program did not see an improvement from baseline to endline relative to control. There was no treatment effect using the child dietary diversity scores, and those are WHO indicators with 7 different food groups. There was an improvement from baseline to endline, and you can see that through our 2 intervention arms, but there's also a similar improvement in our control group, and that would explain the no significant difference using our difference in difference analysis approach. On the left-hand side is an explanation of some of those psychosocial constructs of mothers' confidence, attitudes, and intention to improve child diets. Again, overall, very positive. There were very few changes with paternal self-efficacy, attitudes, and knowledge, or even intention to improve child diets, however. And this might help explain some of the limited impacts on child diet if both husband and wife are not on board. Let me go back a slide just so I don't distract you. But one thing that we did was one method that we conducted were our meal observations. And during our meal observations, we noticed that in our MFH houses, there may be more food groups being consumed. And we had a very small sample size, but we used that formatively to try to look at the child diets a little bit differently. And in the MFH curriculum, the nutrition module promotes a 4-star diet, so 4 food groups rather than the 7 that WHO uses as its indicator. It now uses 8, but at the time, 7 was the standard. And so when we looked at changes in food groups with the 4-star diet as our basis, because that's what MFH was promoting and teaching, we did see a statistical improvement from baseline to end line, although very modest, just 0.14 food groups. With exposure to I2 compared to I1, still a program improvement though over those 12 months. So why might we see some of these modest effects or null effects? I'll present some reach and fidelity and context related findings that might help explain some of these, and then we can open up for discussion. Let's revisit our theory of change, and we'll work through these different constructs a little bit to see where may have been the bottlenecks, both qualitatively and statistically. So of course, this is what we looked at a few slides ago, but the higher cereal prices in Zinder were what we heard from participants. We also heard about maybe delays in this nutrition module rollout, and if true, that occurred during our evaluation period and may have impacted some results. So we took this information, which we developed using secondary data, using qualitative data, and tried to triangulate it with the other data sources that we had. The first thing we wanted to explore was that program reach. And so from 2020, which experienced COVID, only 5% of the MFH couples were trained. And in 2021, although a great improvement, still just 60% of the target was met. In 2020, it was because of COVID. In 2021, we learned that it was because of a lack of the social behavior change communication or job aid or outreach materials that were ready at the time. But by the end of the project, the reach target had been met in terms of MFH trained facilitators. And that's certainly a positive program finding. That said, there's due to the slow rollout, both for care groups and then for MFH nutrition modules in particular, the participants as part of our survey had very low exposure, not the full 12 months to the actual MFH interventions, and not the full exposure to the care groups. So the care groups were rolled out earlier, but with more inconsistency. Some villages didn't start as late as October 2022, and 4 villages, at least within our catchment area, didn't receive the program at all. There was limited MFH nutrition content exposure that was actually added not until November 2022, which was in the middle, actually close to the end of that evaluation period. So the exposure to those nutrition modules may have been only for a couple of months for most of our participants. Despite those implementation-related delays, which happen in all contexts, and rural Niger is an especially difficult one, there was a high to very high satisfaction of nearly all categories pertaining to the MFH sessions. These percentages, which are almost 100% in terms of comfort of the facilities and timing of the sessions and the comprehensible materials, were reflective of the survey results. So these are over 2,000 respondents. In terms of the actual content fidelity, so the messages that were being delivered according to the MFH curriculum, it was nearly perfect during the observations that we attended for the core MFH pieces, and that those covered a lot of health topics, but it was a bit lower for the nutrition modules, although still around 66% of those nutrition messages were delivered according to plan. The facilitators covered the prescribed health topics in, again, about 2/3 of each of those MFH sessions. And the 4-star diet topics were delivered in a little bit of a larger range, but more than half of the messages were delivered in each MFH session on average. And so from a content fidelity perspective, we had 3/4 of the key diet diversity and nutrition messages were being delivered in most sessions. And we don't have the specific benchmarks from the program, what would be considered successful, but I would say from my program evaluation experience that this would be adequate to high fidelity. MFH sessions in particular were highly acceptable to the participants we spoke to, both in focus groups and then also
There we are. Thank you.
and
Maybe put
interviews.
something in here. Okay.
And you signed in every.
Yeah, I
Hi,
saw.
Judy. Oh, thank you. Where was it? Yeah. So this husband mentioned that the reasons why MFH has been accepted in our house environment are that the MFH teachings do not go against our culture or religion, but it teaches us about life as a couple. And really, the program modalities were tailored really well to this sociocultural context, and that was a primary strength that came out of our survey data and all of our qualitative methods. So bravo to that adaptation. As a trained nutritional anthropologist, I think it's a core component of successful implementation. We examined relationship quality also as an outcome or an output specifically of the MFH, but also of the intervention 1, the care plus the SILT groups. So if you look at the left here, this is self-reported relationship quality, both of husbands on the top and wives on the bottom, and they are married couples. Intervention 1 relative to control and intervention 2 relative to control had improvements in relationship quality from baseline to end line among both husbands and wives. In this focus group, we heard that the MFH taught us to live well in harmony with my wives by prioritizing communication and especially decision-making between couples. Communication is essential in married life. It's the nourishing sap of married life. I thought that was a beautiful quote, but it's also one that's reflective of themes that we heard both in focus groups from men and women, as well as through interviews. And I can't say that that was universal among everyone, but it was certainly salient among our MFH participants. We did learn, though, and rural Niger has strong, long-standing, culturally bound gender norms. And although although marital status was reportedly better, neither husbands nor wives had reported any intention to make more joint household-related nutrition decisions. So none of these comparisons are significant from baseline to end line relative to control or relative to one another. And I thought this quote from the interview of a wife who was an MFH participant is especially important and reflective also of what we heard from some men. But I cannot make any decisions without my husband's permission because we are his responsibility. I'm afraid to break the law. If we make decisions without him, he can summon us to our parents. They will not be happy because they think it is unfair for the wife to decide without asking her husband's permission. So sociocultural context certainly matters, and social norms are certainly strong. The qualitative data that we have across interviews with men and women pointed consistently to these poor 2021 agricultural yields. And remember, we collected baseline in 2022, higher food prices, more food market inaccess, and just a lack of financial means to purchase those nutritious foods that were being promoted. But we wanted to corroborate those narratives and accounts with secondary data. Participants statistically had more intention and better normative views to save household income for nutritious foods, but the median savings for the 3 study groups was 0 at baseline and 0 francs at end line, essentially no savings, and there were no differences comparing household savings between the intervention arms. Without the savings, it's pretty difficult to make special food choices, of course. In our sample, 67, or about 2/3 of the Silk Plus Care, that I1 group, and about 2/3 of the I2 group reported higher food prices during 2022, compared to fewer or less than half in the control group. So we were trying to investigate and interrogate that theory of change a little bit about food prices and what we'd heard in qualitative interviews. And we explored secondary data and realized that cereal food prices did rise just before or during our baseline data collection and throughout that 2022 period. Without additional disposable income or more money spent on staple foods, you might imagine there's less disposable income in the household to spend on special nutritious foods during that time period. More than 80% of our participants did report spending more of their household income on those types of typical food purchases. And in fact, in our MFH group, they had a 55% higher odds of spending more money of their income from agricultural and other activities on typical or staple household foods that year, not on special foods. So our conclusion is really there is a lot less financial security during 2022, and as a result, less food security, nutritious food security as well. Really importantly, we explored the participation of community members in these different groups. And so if you want to look at the left-hand side, we had low care group attendance among women. Just half of the Endline survey participants attended more than 4 of the 16 sessions, and that's in both I1 and in I2. And care groups are really where those nutrition messages are first being delivered, or participants are being exposed to them. If we move to the right, there was low participation also, maybe linked to recruitment. We'll have to ask the program team, and we're still trying to understand this a little bit, but in all 3 programs. So the first bullet represents actually the self-reported in our impact survey of those who attended all 3 of the programs. So we had 806 couples who were sampled, but just 14% of them actually had been exposed to all 3 program modalities. We corroborated this with secondary program attendance data, which essentially indicated the same metric, although a little bit lower at 11%. And so exposure was both delayed, but also participation was low, which further may have affected exposure and attenuated any of the outcomes that we saw. But we did a sensitivity analysis to try to understand, among those who had been exposed to those 3 program modalities, was there a greater effect on maternal or child diets? And so this sample size is smaller. If you see the pink at the bottom, this is the 117 who were exposed to all 3 of those interventions. And really the trends are similar. Diet diversity among women did increase from baseline to endline relative to control, and with a similar, about a half of a food group increase. And child diet diversity scores did not increase, again, with that sensitivity analysis. So it really reflects also our original analysis with the larger group. We generated a few important recommendations during our validation meeting. Number 1 is that there should be more complementary agricultural development activities as part of this integrated intervention approach. An implementation team member said that if a new project were designed in the same context for improving food security and nutritional outcomes, it should have a stronger ag and livelihoods related component to address those food and access and agricultural yields challenges faced in 2021 and 2022. MFH facilitators echoed that same sentiment. And this participant said, in short, if agro-pastoral production isn't improved, we won't have the nutritious food we're talking about. Greater income generating activities are important for applying the MFH lessons, and that was a recommendation generated from both stakeholder interviews as well as those who were our participants. We learned that more funds for small businesses, more training sessions, and other agricultural income generating activities, such as sowing, as one example, might prove beneficial in the future. This facilitator said also include in the program the learning of income generating activities to encourage participation. And this is the person who mentioned sowing, as well as the ability to process more agricultural products. We learned from talking to our CRS colleagues that capacity building around this area in rural settings has been explored before, but has faced challenges. And so I'm curious to hear from our CRS colleagues about some of those challenges, if that's a discussion point today. In addition, from a process perspective, we had recommendations around improving that integration and coordination, trying to enhance participation rates in particular above that 11% through more harmonized recruitment processes and strategies, better outreach and shared information sessions across the program modalities, more investment to encourage or to sensitize community members to participate in not one or two, but multiple different activities. And then finally, evaluating this process-related piece throughout the life course of a program. I just have two final slides here to try to pull things together, at least how we see them conceptually. But if you look at our theory of change, the green stars, and these are just some highlights, really represent consistently positive findings from baseline to end line through both qualitative and statistical measures. The programs were highly acceptable. They were tailored to the religious and cultural context. We saw statistical improvements in husband and wife reported marital satisfaction and quality. And then really this third green box, reflects the stars just under it, because the psychosocial outcomes for moms to improve their own diets as well as to improve those of their children were consistently improved, with the exception of knowledge that I talked about earlier. These lightning bolts, and I apologize, I couldn't find a better icon, but I think it does the trick, highlight some of the challenges that we saw through this theory of change. If you move left to right, certainly that low participation and exposure to all three of those program activities limited the ability of the program to see effects in any one pathway. The lack of savings and the median savings of 0 from baseline to end line was certainly a challenge. And if you go to the top right, rural Niger is a strongly conservative cultural context, and changing social norms doesn't happen overnight. A lot of what this program aimed to do was to shift norms around gender, and maybe 12 months was not enough time to see some of those changes, but that certainly contributed to that gap between intention and then actual behavior. We didn't see any improvement in women's actual household decision-making inputs for nutrition, and we didn't see that intention either, and certainly that's probably linked to the gender norms above. The shocks and the hazards, the challenges faced environmentally in rural Niger in terms of higher food prices is certainly another barrier between intention and behavior, and is a nice lesson learned or discussion point for this program and others, how to address such external shocks or hazards. So I will stop there. I think I'm a bit over time. I apologize, but hopefully that was a nice, concise summary on behalf of my colleagues. Thank you, and we'll open it up for questions at this time. Over.
Thanks very much, Steve. For that presentation. I know it was a lot of information to present in a succinct fashion, and I think thank you for doing such a great job. I had said that perhaps this part of the session I would help to moderate some of the questions and comments that have come. We did put an invitation in the chat asking participants to write questions or comments, and we have a few. But before that, I think we've got maybe about a maximum 15 minutes, because we do want to leave a few minutes to hand over to you, Beatrice, to wrap us up. But I will pause for just a second if there's anyone from the CRS or Penn State team that would just like to respond to any of the presentation in 1 or 2 minutes before we go into questions. Okay, if not, there was a first question. I know Karine had to leave, but she did ask the researchers, so that would be for your team, Steve. What was the most surprising or unexpected finding on the part of your team, I might say?
Oh, I can't speak for everyone, but I think for me personally was that the participation rates. We expected that those who are exposed to the 3 intervention modalities to be much higher than 11 to 14%, and that's a primary driver of some of the results or not that we saw. Maybe others have some more surprising outcomes to talk about too.
Go ahead, Muzi. Yes, I see you're in camera. Wonderful. Please.
Yeah. Thanks, Steve, for the nice presentation. So for us, from the data part, it could be a mix of the surprise and the expectation because of the lack of mediation effect when you look at the changes in those psychosocial determinants, but then linking that to the final DDS behavior. When we put that, the potential mediator into the model, very little variance will be explained from that mediation. So that could be one of the surprises we identified, but we sort of discuss it through the when we interpret the data. So I said surprise plus expectation.
Great. Thank you, Muzi. Thanks very much. I'm going to move on to the next question, but Steve, I saw you just dropped something in the chat saying that you have a gender index that you're analyzing and to see how this fits into the TOC. Is that in relation also to this question about what was surprising, or?
No, I was just responding to Michelle Gamber's question about gender. That's certainly an important piece here. We presented, Michelle, basically qualitative findings related to gender. We have our dear Rafia, Michelle, is looking at kind of the gender impact evaluation findings to see how they might fit into this. That wasn't a primary outcome of ours, but it would be nice to have some of those statistically backed gender findings to see or to corroborate what we've heard qualitatively. So great question, Michelle, and we'll include that in a report, of course. But thank you. Excellent.
Thanks, Stevia. Thanks for bringing that up. And that was going to be the next comment. And so glad to see that you're already proactively looking at that using the index that you just mentioned. I'll go on to Yusufan's question. And I think you've addressed this in part throughout the presentation, but if there's more that you or a member of the research team or even the CRS team would like to say, basically there's more behavior change in women than men. Have men been targeted as equally as women? So you may have some comments on that. Has this had an impact in terms of putting in practice better decisions as men have more decision-making power? I think you talked a bit at length about that and the sort of slowness of changing gender norms, particularly around decision-making, but I don't know if there's any final words you want to say around how men were targeted.
Yeah, I think I would defer to the CRS team specifically. Men were a central part, though, of the MFH session. They were certainly important in the SILK sessions. So they were a core component of this. I will say that their diets did not change as a secondary outcome of this. We didn't present those findings. We just presented the maternal and child dietary findings. But you're right. The psychosocial outcomes related to men were more variable, and a little bit less or more difficult to interpret, and so the men are a critically important part of this puzzle, and I think it's a key question, Yosefani, how to engage them successfully if household level behavior change and norms are really a primary emphasis. I don't have an answer to that. That's a huge question for our whole global community, but maybe CRS colleagues can talk about the targeting of men in particular, if that's helpful at this stage. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Steve. Valerie, I see your hand is up. Did you want to shed a bit more light around this issue around targeting men? Thank you, Steve, for also answering the question in the chat.
Great, thank you so much. I mean, the CRS Niger team can talk more specifically, but I know from kind of the nutrition content wise, I mean, the main nutrition content is through the care groups in which we know target women. And the nutrition content that was in the MFH sessions were it was just one lesson actually that kind of dove into what is a diverse diet, what makes up a diverse diet, and it talked about the different food groups and then the 4-star diet at the same time. And, you know, how does that diet vary or the quantity of food vary across the different ages of children and life stages for women. So the content of nutrition knowledge is probably a lot less that reach our men than would have been if women were all participating in the normal care group. I don't know if your team has anything else they would like to add to that, but I just wanted to highlight that the nutrition content MFH was building off of the care group approach, but was very limited and was just more of a refresher as a reminder, and then kind of really basic content for our male partners.
Great, thanks, Valerie. You know, not to put our Emily. Okay, please go ahead. Sorry, I'm a little slow with.
Sure. Thank you, Michelle. And again, the members of the GERMA team could speak more specifically to this, but continuing on participation across genders. Mm-hmm. So based on my understanding, care group does almost entirely target women. And while Silk targets both genders, women are much more highly targeted in this activity as well. So I know the group is digging into some of this data because I think if the unit of measurement is each individual in MFH, then yes, of course, we would see a drop off of men in the other two activities. If the unit of measurement's the couple, I think that could be very interesting because of the targeting largely of women across the other two activities. But this could also explain, less of an impact on men in terms of nutrition behaviors and decision making as well, just the targeting across some of those other activities, particularly care group. Over.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Emily. I don't know. I mean, I'm just pausing to see if there's any other comments from CRS on this particular issue. Okay, I think, yeah, Martha, thanks. Please go ahead. Welcome.
Yes, so it's just for mentioning another element that could have had an impact on this less behavior change from the men's side. So the rollout of the nutrition module in MFH started later than expected, and its fidelity was a little bit lower compared to other modules. So this could also have had an impact because we saw that, for example, paternal knowledge, as well as other intermediate factors as attitudes, intentions, self-efficacy for child diets did not improve. So even knowledge. So probably this was really influenced by this late rollout.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely, Martha. Thank you. I think that's a very pertinent point, and yeah, one that certainly seems to be credible to me. I'm going to move to Judy's question, and I see that you already responded, Steve. I'll just, for those who may not be monitoring the chat, I will just restate the question. So Judy asks, do the care groups respond to participants' concerns, or do they have a predetermined messaging structure? And again, Steve, I think you gave an element of response here, but I do invite, you know, others who may want to add. Steve, I don't know, you may want to come off mute and just summarize your answer for folks who may not be following the chat.
Yeah, Judy, that was just my guess. I would guess, you know, from my certainly more limited experience that there's usually the curriculum that care groups do follow in terms of messaging, but like you said, people come and go, but also there are some questions. It's not a fully top down, it certainly shouldn't be, but it's also not fully participatory, either like nutrition counseling is prescribed. So usually the reality is somewhere in between. Maybe the CRS team can explain how, in theory, it is meant to be rolled out in the GIRMA. Over.
That's great. No, great. Thank you, Steve. I don't know if any of our CRS colleagues want to add any specific thoughts around, as you just said, Steve, how the curriculum is meant to be rolled out. And I think your comment, Judy, is very well taken around people dipping in and out of the groups according to what they find most interesting. If no more comments from our team, yeah, maybe Judy, I don't know, is there anything else you wanted to add? I mean, this is interesting. I think over your number of years of observing these groups, these peer groups, great to hear any other thoughts. Go ahead, thanks.
Morning, afternoon, everybody. Unfortunately, I tuned in late because I was having problems logging into Zoom, so I'm be very interested in seeing the and listening to the recording. Yeah, I'm thinking back to an experience I had a number of years ago in with a child survival project in Bolivia, where the peer support groups essentially evolved according to the participants' concerns. So when men started asking questions, they started groups for men. When people wanted to get into different issues like education, they got into those issues, and the participation remained fairly good from the community members because they were responding to their concerns. There was one particularly salient point that people were learning about hygiene, and the women who were living in El Alto in La Paz decided that they wanted plumbing and toilets. And essentially they led a protest march. And this came out of the nutrition peer support groups. They led a protest march and they convinced the mayor of El Alto to invest in a sewage system. And then they were very much, on top of the city to make sure that their toilets got installed. And so and speaking with a number of people who have also been at this for a long time, like the Baby Friendly Community Initiative in the Gambia, which many of you have heard me talk about in the past, adding on, that is, sort of sequencing and layering additional concerns, even if that means you're constantly updating your facilitators, and which they appreciate as well, really helps to keep the interest high. So, for example, Stephen, in some of the things that you were talking about the need for more agro food security type activities, probably if those things had been added in and there had been possibilities of discussing what kind of non-agricultural livelihoods or additional livelihoods people might be involved in, it probably would have helped the participation. And however, the sort of traditional model of care groups is essentially this predetermined curriculum, which offers some flexibility, but not a lot. And there's a lot more top-down messaging than listening to participants and listening and responding to their concerns, even if you can't respond in the moment. Even if everybody has to go out and research and do some more work to be able to respond, it still seems to lead to more sustained interest on the part of the participants. Over.
Thank you, Judy. No, I think great reflections. And I think, I mean, I'd be happy to, I know we've got just 2 minutes left, but be happy to, had be more time, hear others' thoughts on that. But I think absolutely, I think that flexibility and the adaptability we're learning is so critical. And then, as you say, the listening to participants, concerns, I think in addition to delivering, or maybe instead of delivering messages. One of the things I can say, yeah, I agree. It would be great to see, Judy, if you're able to share the Bolivia case study, perhaps with the IDEAL team. I think both the Penn State and CRS teams would be really interested in seeing that, or any other examples. The one thing I could say briefly is that we can also, in terms of how the care groups, more details and how the approach was rolled out in this particular instance, we can certainly refer back to Guillermo's nutrition lead, who can, provide more detail, which we can then, provide to you, the Penn State team, if you wanted to take a look at that and see how that might figure in the final report. We are now at 29 minutes after the hour. I did promise that I would hand it back to you, Beatrice, sorry, to close this out, maybe with some next steps. But so without further ado, I'll just hand it back to you, Beatrice. Thank you. Thanks to everybody for your attention.
Thanks, Michelle. And thank you all for your hard work on this project. That was an interesting, very interesting presentation. I think just for next steps, it's worth mentioning that the draft final report will be out for IDEAL and BHA review and comment at the end of August. And then we'll look forward to seeing a final report in September, and socialization webinars and Twitter storms, etc. after that. Is that correct, Michelle?
Yes, that's it. That pretty much sums it up. Absolutely. Give or take a few activities, etc. But yeah, that's a great summary. So that's the idea. Aim to get a report by the end of the month for BHA to take a look at over a couple of weeks. And then eventually, hopefully towards the end of September, we get to a final report. And then, as you say, all of the dissemination and sharing activities.
Wonderful. Great. Well, we'll look forward to that. We look forward to reading the report and hearing more, and socializing and disseminating this research further. So thank you once again, everyone, for joining, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you, Beatrice. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.